You actually think you can code?" The tech CEO sneered as his assistant dumped coffee on the homeless girl's laptop. But they had just destroyed evidence of the one person who could save or sink his entire company. Before we continue, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The afternoon sun cast geometric shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cross Technologies' flagship store in downtown Austin. Julian Cross stood at the edge of the gleaming showroom, surveying his empire with the satisfaction of someone who had conquered Silicon Valley before turning 30. Custom Cybertrucks lined the polished concrete floor, each one a testament to his vision of the future. "Sir, the quarterly presentation is ready," his assistant Brandon Wright announced, adjusting his designer glasses. The media event would showcase their latest security software. The system Julian personally guaranteed was mathematically impossible to breach. At 29, Julian commanded attention not through volume, but through results. His tailored Tom Ford suit, his collection of limited edition smartwatches, his casual mention of dining with senators, all of it carefully curated to Project Invincibility. He'd built Cross Technologies from a Stanford dorm room into a $40 billion empire, and everyone knew it. Outside, the November rain had intensified, sending Austin's homeless population scrambling for shelter. Most businesses along 6th Street had already locked their doors, but Cross's flagship store remained open, hosting the press event that would dominate tomorrow's tech headlines. That's when Maya Santos slipped inside. At 17, she had learned to move like smoke, present but unnoticed. Her oversized hoodie was soaked through, her backpack held together with duct tape, and her laptop, her most precious possession, was wrapped in plastic bags to protect it from the rain. She wasn't here for the presentation. She was here because the store's Wi-Fi reached the alcove where she'd been sleeping, and she desperately needed to download security patches before her system became completely vulnerable. She pressed herself against a display column, trying to stay invisible as wealthy tech journalists and investors filled the showroom. Their designer shoes clicked against the floor, their perfume mixing with the scent of expensive coffee from the catering setup. Maya's eyes tracked to the massive screens showing code she recognized immediately, Cross's new security software. Her breath caught. Even from across the room, she could see the fatal flaw in the encryption architecture. It was elegant, impressive, and completely broken. Anyone with her level of knowledge could walk through the backdoor Julian's team had accidentally created. She should leave, should disappear back into the rain, should mind her own business like she'd learned to do after 8 months on the streets. But the vulnerability was catastrophic, and judging by the confident smiles on stage, nobody on Julian's team had any idea they were about to release software that would expose millions of customers to exactly the threats they claimed to prevent. Maya pulled out her battered laptop, ignoring the water damage and missing keys. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, documenting the vulnerability with the precision of someone who had taught herself advanced cryptography in public libraries. She could prove it. She could show them exactly how broken their unbreakable system was. She just needed to get someone's attention. Julian was mid-presentation when he noticed the commotion. A small figure had emerged from behind the display column, walking toward the stage with a determination that seemed impossible given her obvious circumstances. Security was already moving to intercept. "Sir, we have a situation," Brandon whispered urgently into his earpiece. But Maya had already reached the base of the stage, holding up her laptop. "Your encryption is broken," she called out, her voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes turning toward her. "I can prove it. You're about to release software with a vulnerability that—" The laughter started slowly, then built like a wave. Tech journalists exchanged amused glances. Investors smirked at each other. Julian's famous smile widened as he took in a homeless teenager, claiming to have found a flaw his $200 million development team had missed. "Security," Julian said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "Please escort our guest outside." "Wait," Maya insisted, stepping forward. "I'm serious. There's a back door in your certificate validation layer. I can show you exactly." Brandon descended from the stage, his expression a mixture of disgust and amusement. "Listen, kid," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this is a private event for actual professionals, not street kids playing hacker." He reached for her laptop, and Maya instinctively pulled it back. The movement was defensive, protective of the only valuable thing she owned. But Brandon interpreted it as aggression. "Oh, we've got a fighter," he announced to the crowd, which responded with more laughter. He grabbed the laptop from her hands, holding it up like a trophy. "What is this? A Chromebook held together with duct tape. And you think you can evaluate our enterprise-level security architecture?" "Give it back," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that nobody heard. "That has my documentation." "Documentation?" Brandon laughed harder. He turned to the coffee station behind him, where an industrial-grade espresso machine was brewing. "Let me show you what we think of documentation from homeless hackers." In one smooth motion, he appended his full coffee cup over her laptop. The hot liquid splashed across the keyboard, seeping into the circuits, destroying months of work in seconds. The crowd gasped, but it was shock mixed with entertainment. Phones appeared from every direction, recording the spectacle. But it was Julian's laugh, that confident, entitled cackle, that cut deepest. "Brandon, you're terrible," Julian called out from the stage, his tone carrying pride rather than reprimand. "But effective. Someone get maintenance to clean this up." Maya stood perfectly still, watching coffee drip from her destroyed laptop onto the polished floor. 8 months of surviving on the streets had taught her to control her reactions. Years in foster care before that had taught her to hide pain behind blank expressions. But this wasn't just a laptop. It was her evidence, her proof, her documentation of not just Julian's security flaw, but of dozens of other vulnerabilities she discovered in major systems. It was her ticket out of homelessness, her portfolio of skills that no credentials could prove, but results could demonstrate, and they had just destroyed it while laughing. The silence stretched as Maya carefully set down her ruined laptop. Coffee continued to drip from its edges, pooling on the floor. She looked up at Julian on his stage, surrounded by his wealth and power and absolute certainty that he was untouchable. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying in the tense quiet. "You just made my decision much easier." Confusion flickered across Julian's face. He'd expected tears, anger, maybe a scene he could use to paint her as unstable. Instead, she was looking at him with something that looked almost like pity. "What decision?" he asked, his smile faltering slightly. Maya reached into her backpacks in her pocket, the one she'd waterproofed with layers of plastic, and pulled out a USB drive. "The decision about whether to report the vulnerability privately or publicly," she said clearly, "and whether to include the other documentation I've been compiling." She held up the drive, making sure every camera caught it. "This contains proof that your unbreakable security software has a fatal flaw. It contains the exact code needed to exploit that flaw. It contains timestamp documentation showing I discovered this vulnerability 72 hours ago and attempted to report it through your official channels, where it was deleted as spam." The room had gone completely quiet now. Julian's smile had disappeared entirely. "It also contains," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger, "documentation of 17 other critical vulnerabilities in systems developed by Cross Technologies over the past 3 years. Vulnerabilities that were reported by other researchers and ignored. Vulnerabilities that have been actively exploited by hackers, costing your clients millions in stolen data." She looked around the room, making eye contact with journalists whose expressions had shifted from amusement to intense interest. "You laughed when I tried to help you. You destroyed my equipment. You humiliated me in front of cameras. So now I'm making a different choice." Maya walked calmly to the nearest journalist, a woman from TechCrunch she recognized from bylines. "This USB drive contains everything. Publish it all. Let the world see what unbreakable really means to Cross Technologies." The journalist took the drive with trembling hands, already understanding the magnitude of the story she'd just been handed. Maya turned back to Julian, who stood frozen on stage, his face pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. "Boys will be boys, and companies will be companies," she said, echoing his earlier dismissal. "We all make our choices, and we all live with consequences." She picked up her destroyed laptop, cradling it like a wounded friend. "I choose to walk away from people who think cruelty is entertainment, no matter how rich they are." The silence in the showroom was absolute. Security had stopped advancing, unsure whether to intervene. Cameras captured every moment: the coffee-destroyed laptop, the USB drive in the journalist's hand, the CEO's look of dawning horror. "Good luck with your product launch," Maya said as she headed for the door. "You're going to need it." The rain hit her face as she stepped back outside, but this time she didn't run from it. Behind her, the carefully orchestrated press event dissolved into chaos as journalists crowded around their colleague, demanding copies of the drive's contents. In that moment, Maya Santos, homeless, credentialless, dismissed, had just detonated a bomb that would expose one of Silicon Valley's fastest rising stars as either incompetent or criminally negligent. The click of expensive shoes on wet pavement made Maya turn. Julian Cross stood in the rain, his Tom Ford suit already soaked, his perfect hair plastered to his forehead. Behind him, through the store windows, she could see chaos. Journalists on phones, investors looking panicked, Brandon frantically trying to contain the situation. "Wait," Julian said, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "That USB drive. What you said about the vulnerabilities. Is it," he struggled with the word, "true?" Maya adjusted her backpack, ready to disappear into the Austin streets she knew so well. "You had your chance to find out privately. You chose humiliation instead." "I didn't," Julian started, then stopped. They both knew exactly what he'd done, what he'd allowed, what he'd laughed at. "If what you're claiming is accurate, my company faces billions in losses. Lawsuits, criminal investigations, if we knowingly ignored vulnerabilities." "Yes," Maya said simply. "You do." Julian ran his hand through his wet hair, a gesture of frustration she recognized from watching him on stage. "The flaw you mentioned, in the certificate validation layer. That would require someone with expertise in asymmetric cryptography, zero-knowledge proofs, and post-quantum cryptographic systems," Maya finished. "Yes, I taught myself those concepts to understand why cryptocurrency security was failing. Then I applied the same principles to your authentication protocols." "Where did you?" Julian stopped himself. "You taught yourself while living on the streets." "Public libraries have good Wi-Fi," Maya replied. "And when you're homeless, you have a lot of time to study. No social life, no Netflix subscription, no distractions. Just pure learning." Her words hit Julian like accusations, each one highlighting the waste of his own privileged education. He'd attended Stanford, been mentored by tech legends, had every resource imaginable. Yet this teenager with nothing had seen critical flaws his $200 million team had missed. "The other vulnerabilities you mentioned," Julian said carefully. 17 previous reports we supposedly ignored. Do you have proof of that?" Maya almost laughed. "Do I have proof? Mr. Cross, I've spent the last 8 months doing nothing but documenting corporate security failures. When you're sleeping in subway tunnels and police libraries close, analyzing security breaches is how you pass the time. I have screenshots of every report submitted to your company's security portal. I have your automated responses marking them as spam. I have timestamps showing how long it took your systems to delete them." She pulled her destroyed laptop from her backpack, water and coffee still dripping from it. This had 6 months of research. Every vulnerability documented with proof-of-concept exploits. Every attempt to report them through proper channels. Every dismissal. But the USB drive has copies of everything, plus documentation of how I discovered your current flaw 72 hours ago, how I tried to report it, how your system flagged it as spam because it came from a Proton Mail account instead of a corporate email address. Julian's face went from pale to gray. "That journalist, she's going to publish all of it." That's what investigative journalists do with evidence of corporate negligence, Maya said, especially when it's handed to them at a press event on camera by the CEO's own assistant after he destroyed my equipment. Behind them, sirens approached. Julian glanced back at a showroom, where the chaos had spread to the street. Investors were fleeing. His PR team was shouting into phones. The product launch that was supposed to secure Cross Technology's dominance had become a disaster. "I'll pay you," Julian said suddenly. "Name your price. $1 million. $5 million. Just tell that journalist not to publish. Give me time to fix the vulnerabilities before they become public." Maya looked at him with something approaching pity. "Mr. Cross, you can't buy your way out of this. You had time. You had resources. You had experts trying to warn you. You chose to ignore all of it because you were so certain you were the smartest person in the room. I made a mistake." "You made a choice," Maya corrected. "When Brandon destroyed my laptop, you laughed. When I tried to warn you, you had security try to remove me. Those weren't mistakes. Those were decisions that revealed who you really are." The rain intensified, but neither of them moved. They stood in the intersection of their two worlds, his crumbling empire of privilege, her hard-won expertise born from necessity. "What if I offered you something else?" Julian asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "Not money. A position. Chief Security Officer. Full control over our security architecture. Whatever resources you need to fix everything." "You mean hire the homeless girl you just humiliated to save your company?" Maya shook her head. "Even if I wanted to work for you, which I don't, I'm 17. I haven't finished high school. I don't even have a permanent address. Your board would never approve it. I don't care about the board. I care about my company surviving the next 24 hours." Maya studied his face, seeing genuine fear beneath the remnants of arrogance. "You should have thought about that before you destroyed my laptop while your investors watched." She turned to leave, then paused. "There's one thing I want, though. Not from you. From them." She pointed back at the showroom, where Brandon and the other executives were visible through the windows. "I want every person who laughed recorded on camera apologizing. Not to me. To every self-taught developer, every person without credentials, every homeless kid trying to learn technology in public libraries. I want them to admit that expertise doesn't require expensive degrees or comfortable addresses." "That's," Julian started to say impossible, then stopped. Nothing was impossible compared to what was coming. "I'll make it happen. Today. But in exchange, please, just talk to that journalist. Explain the context. Give me a chance to respond before." "Mr. Cross," Maya interrupted gently. "It's too late for that. The story is already uploading. Your company's stock is already dropping. By tomorrow morning, you'll be explaining to federal regulators why you ignored known vulnerabilities in systems handling millions of people's personal data." She hoisted her backpack higher on her shoulders. "But I'll tell you what I told your security team when they deleted my first warning. The vulnerability is fixable. It requires a complete re-architecture of your authentication layer, but it's technically possible. You have the resources. You just need the humility to admit you were wrong." "And you? What will you do?" Maya shrugged. "Same thing I've been doing. Teaching myself. Documenting problems. Trying to make systems more secure even though people like you keep laughing at people like me." She started walking away, her soaked sneakers squelching against the pavement. "Oh, and Mr. Cross, next time a homeless kid tells you your security is broken, maybe listen before you destroy their equipment." She disappeared into the rain-soaked Austin streets, leaving Julian standing alone in front of his empire as it began to crumble. 3 days after the coffee incident, Julian found himself in a place he'd never imagined, the entrance to an Austin homeless shelter, waiting to speak with the teenager who had just destroyed his company's reputation. The media fallout had been catastrophic. TechCrunch's expose, Cross Technologies, billion-dollar security theater, had gone viral within hours. The 17 documented vulnerabilities Maya had discovered were being independently verified by security researchers worldwide. Each confirmed flaw triggered new waves of customer lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny. Julian's board had held an emergency session. Investors were demanding answers. The SEC had launched an investigation. And through it all, the image that kept replaying was Brandon dumping coffee on a homeless girl's laptop while Julian laughed. A shelter worker finally appeared. A middle-aged black woman named Patricia, more with kind eyes and a skeptical expression. "Mr. Cross, Maya says she'll give you 5 minutes, but I'm staying in the room. That girl's been through enough." She led him to a small meeting room with fluorescent lights and donated furniture. Maya sat at a plastic table, her destroyed laptop open in front of her, apparently trying to salvage something from the coffee-damaged circuitry. "I'm surprised you came," Maya said without looking up. "Thought you'd send lawyers." "They're coming next," Julian admitted, sitting down uninvited. "But I wanted to talk first. To understand." "Understand what?" "How your company ignored basic security practices. How your team deleted vulnerability reports because they didn't come from credible sources. How you humiliated someone who was trying to help you." Maya's voice remained calm, but her fingers worked faster on the laptop's internals. "Understand how you learned all this," Julian said. "Your analysis was. The vulnerabilities you documented are real," Maya finished. "I know. I spent 3 months verifying each one, testing exploits in isolated environments, building proof-of-concept attacks, all with borrowed library computers and whatever equipment I could salvage from e-waste bins." She finally looked up at him. "You want to know my secret? It's simple. I didn't assume I was the smartest person in the room. I questioned everything. I tested assumptions. I learned from people you'd never hire because they don't have the right zip codes or university credentials." Julian absorbed this, feeling the weight of his own wasted advantages. "Patricia said you're trying to salvage the laptop. I'll replace it. Top of the line." "I don't want your charity," Maya cut in. "I want my research back. 6 months of vulnerability documentation that your assistant destroyed for laughs." The backup on the USB drive wasn't complete. This laptop had analysis of 30 other major systems. Proof that the problems in your software aren't unique, they're industry-wide. That research is gone now, corrupted by expensive coffee. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Julian noticed how protective she was of Maya, standing like a guardian between them. "What if I offered resources?" Julian tried again. "Not a job, I understand you're 17. But access to our lab equipment, proper computers, a stipend to continue your research independently. You could finish high school, continue documenting vulnerabilities, build a portfolio. While you get to look like the magnanimous CEO who discovered a homeless prodigy." Maya's eyes narrowed. "That's a nice redemption arc for you. But what about the other kids in this shelter? The ones who are brilliant at things you don't value? The single mother down the hall who taught herself web development, but can't get hired because she has a criminal record from a bad check she wrote during a medical emergency." She closed the destroyed laptop carefully. "Mr. Cross, you want to help me because my skills can save your company. That's not help. That's self-interest dressed up as generosity." "Then what would actual help look like?" Julian asked, surprising himself with the genuine question. Maya studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he was serious. "You really want to know?" "I wouldn't be here otherwise." "Fine. Actual help would mean creating opportunities for everyone in this shelter, not just the ones with marketable tech skills. It would mean funding programs that teach people without stable housing. It would mean stopping your company's practice of background checks that automatically disqualify anyone with gaps in employment or addresses that aren't permanent residences. It would mean admitting that your hiring practices are designed to exclude people like us." She stood up, gathering her destroyed laptop. "It would mean understanding that genius doesn't just exist in Stanford dorms. It exists here, in shelters and libraries and subway tunnels. But you have to actually look for it instead of waiting for it to save your company." Patricia nodded approvingly. Julian felt like he was in a business negotiation where the other side held all the cards. What if I did all of that, he asked. What if I created a program specifically designed to identify and support technical talent in unexpected places? No credential requirements. No address requirements. Just demonstrated skill. I'd say you're still thinking too small, Maya replied, because this isn't just about technical talent. Every person in this shelter has skills that society devalues. The guy who can repair any engine but has no ASE certification. The woman who speaks 4 languages but doesn't have a college degree. The veteran with PTSD who knows logistics better than any supply chain manager. Your hypothetical program would help a handful of people while leaving the system that failed everyone else unchanged. She moved toward the door, then paused. But if you're serious about trying, if you actually want to do something that matters instead of just saving your reputation, come back in a week with a real plan. Not charity, not a PR stunt. A systematic approach to finding and supporting intelligence wherever it exists. And if I do, then maybe I'll tell you where I backed up my complete research, Maya said. The 30 systems I analyzed. The vulnerabilities your industry keeps ignoring. The solutions that actually work because I had to make them work with nothing. Julian stood. 1 week. I'll have a proposal ready. Mr. Cross, Patricia said as he turned to leave. That girl just gave you a roadmap to saving your company and your soul. Don't waste it. Outside the shelter, Julian sat in his Tesla for several minutes, processing the conversation. His phone buzzed constantly. More bad news, more damage control, more evidence of how badly he'd miscalculated everything. But Maya's words kept echoing. You're still thinking too small. For the first time in his career, Julian Cross realized that being the smartest person in the room had made him the blindest. 6 months after the coffee incident, Maya stood before a wall of screens in a converted warehouse in East Austin. Around her, 40 teenagers from shelters, foster care, and precarious housing situations worked on cutting-edge security projects. The space buzzed with the energy of people who had something to prove. The Codebridge Academy, named not for its focus on programming, but for its mission of building connections between overlooked talent and opportunity, had exceeded even Julian's optimistic projections. But the journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. The transformation had started with resistance. Julian's board had been furious at his proposal to create a program with no credential requirements. His investors had threatened to pull funding. His executive team had questioned his judgment, some suggesting the stress of the scandal had impaired his decision-making. But the public pressure was undeniable. After TechCrunch's exposé, other journalists had dug deeper. They'd found patterns of cross-technologies, dismissing security reports from researchers without prestigious affiliations. They'd uncovered a company culture that valued pedigree over performance, credentials over capability. The breaking point came when an anonymous source leaked internal Slack messages. Julian's own engineering team had mocked security reports from independent researchers, making jokes about wannabe hackers and script kiddies who probably learned everything from YouTube. The optics were devastating. While Julian had been building his reputation as an innovative disruptor, his company had been embodying the exact elitism that Silicon Valley claimed to reject. You need to control this narrative, his crisis management team had urged. Position yourself as someone who learned from mistakes. The homeless prodigy angle writes itself. But Maya had been right. Using her as a redemption arc would have been exploitation dressed as opportunity. So Julian had done something radical for someone in his position. He'd actually listened. The person who made it possible was Dr. Sharon Mitchell, a professor at UT Austin who had been studying the intersection of homelessness and technical education for a decade. When Julian reached out to her, skeptical but desperate, she'd given him a reading list that was both humbling and enlightening. Your problem, Dr. Mitchell had explained during their first meeting, is that you are trying to find exceptional people to save. But the assumption that homeless youth need saving is part of what keeps them marginalized. They don't need rescue. They need resources, respect, and removal of systematic barriers. She'd introduced him to other academics, community organizers, and most importantly, to current and former homeless youth who could articulate exactly what was wrong with traditional approaches to helping. The Codebridge program that emerged was built on principles Maya had outlined. 1. No credentials required admission was based entirely on demonstrated skills through practical challenges. No transcripts, no SAT scores, no recommendation letters from teachers at schools many participants had never been able to attend consistently. 2. Holistic support housing assistance came first. You couldn't code effectively when you were worried about where you'd sleep. Mental health services, case managers, food security, all built into the program before anyone wrote a single line of code. 3. Compensation. Not charity participants were paid for their work from day one. Not stipends or scholarships, but actual wages for the security research they conducted. Their contributions had monetary value. The program recognized that explicitly. 4. Community integration. Instead of extracting promising youth from their communities, Codebridge built resources within those communities. The warehouse in East Austin was deliberately chosen to be accessible to the homeless populations it served. 5. Systematic change advocacy. The program lobbied companies to eliminate background checks for technical positions, to remove address requirements from job applications, to stop requiring LinkedIn profiles and GitHub accounts that assume continuous internet access and stable housing. You're teaching corporations to see us as human, one participant had told Julian during a site visit. That might be more important than the coding. I know. That's why I need to decide what to do with it. Maya looked at Julian directly. 6 months ago, I gave one journalist a USB drive, and it almost destroyed your company. I'm sitting on evidence that could destabilize the entire tech industry. I need to know. Have you learned enough that I can trust you to help me navigate this responsibly? The question hung in the air. This was Julian's test, not of his technical knowledge, but of whether he truly internalized the lessons of the past 6 months. First question, he said carefully. Have you attempted to report these vulnerabilities through official channels? Yes, every single one. I used my real name, my UT Austin email address, provided detailed documentation. 90% never got human review. The 10% that did got form rejection letters. Then the companies have been warned, Julian said. You fulfilled your ethical obligations. But public disclosure could cause real harm to millions of users whose data is at risk while the vulnerabilities remain unpatched. Which is why I haven't published anything, Maya said. But I also won't wait indefinitely while companies ignore problems that could be exploited any day. Dr. Mitchell interjected. This is beyond either of your capabilities to handle alone. Maya, you need legal counsel. Julian, you need to recuse yourself from any decisions that could benefit Cross Technologies specifically. This requires a neutral third party with the authority and resources to compel action. The federal government, Maya said flatly. You want me to go to the feds. CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Dr. Mitchell clarified. They have both the authority to require patches and the capability to coordinate responsible disclosure across multiple organizations. And a history of being bureaucratic and slow, Maya countered. While they coordinate, people's data gets stolen. You're right. Julian surprised them both by agreeing. But you've also proven that working outside systems, while effective for exposing problems, doesn't always lead to solutions. CISA is slow, but they can enforce compliance in ways you can't. He pulled out his phone. I have contacts there from the investigation into Cross Technologies. People who actually understood the technical issues and took them seriously. What if I facilitate introductions, but you control the narrative? You present the findings, you set the terms for disclosure, you decide timelines. Maya considered this. And what do you get out of it? Hopefully, an industry that's more secure, Julian said honestly, and maybe partial redemption for ignoring warnings until a homeless teenager had to publicly humiliate me into paying attention. You're never going to fully redeem yourself for that coffee incident, Maya said, but her tone was almost teasing. But this is a start. 3 months later, Maya stood in a congressional hearing room, facing the House Committee on Homeland Security. At 18, she was the youngest person ever to testify as an expert witness on cybersecurity matters. The journey to this moment had been surreal. After connecting with CISA, her documentation had triggered emergency meetings at the highest levels of government. The scope of the vulnerabilities she discovered and the systematic pattern of companies ignoring security reports had elevated the issue to national security priority. Major tech CEOs had been summoned. Some had come with armies of lawyers. Others, taking their cue from Julian's experience, had come with humility and plans for reform. Ms. Santos, the committee chairwoman, began. You've presented evidence of critical security vulnerabilities in systems used by millions of Americans. These vulnerabilities were reported through official channels and ignored. Can you explain why you believe this happened? Maya leaned forward to the microphone, conscious of the cameras broadcasting to millions. Representative, the pattern is clear. Companies have built reporting systems that automatically filter out submissions from people without prestigious credentials. A security report from a Stanford professor gets immediate executive attention. An identical report from a self-taught researcher living in a homeless shelter gets deleted as spam. She pulled up her presentation on the committee room screens. This isn't about individual company failures. It's about industry-wide bias that assumes expertise only comes from specific universities, specific companies, specific backgrounds. That bias created systematic blindness to critical security issues. A Republican committee member jumped in. But Ms. Santos, aren't you proving that the system works? You were able to expose these issues. Your warning was heard eventually. After I had my laptop destroyed at a press event, Maya replied calmly. After I had to choose between responsible private disclosure and public exposure. The system only worked because I was lucky enough to be at the right place at the right time with media present. What about all the other researchers whose warnings were ignored and didn't have that opportunity? She clicked to the next slide. I've documented 47 independent security researchers who reported critical vulnerabilities in the last 3 years. Vulnerabilities that were later exploited in major breaches. Every single one of them was ignored because they didn't have the right credentials, email domains, or professional affiliations. The room buzzed with murmurs. Journalists in the press gallery typed furiously. My recommendations are straightforward. Maya continued. First, require companies to have human review of all security submissions, regardless of source. Second, mandate public disclosure of vulnerability reports that go unaddressed for 90 days. Third, protect researchers from legal retaliation when they responsibly disclose security issues. And fourth, she paused for emphasis, stop requiring credentials that have nothing to do with demonstrated capability. A Democrat committee member nodded approvingly. Ms. Santos, you're currently enrolled at UT Austin studying computer science, correct? Yes, sir. Why pursue a degree if you believe credentials don't matter? Maya smiled slightly. Because the system hasn't changed yet. I need that piece of paper to be taken seriously in rooms like this one. But I'm working to change that system so the next person with my skills doesn't need to waste 4 years proving something they could demonstrate in 4 months. The hearing continued for 3 hours. Tech CEOs squirmed as their company's practices were exposed. Julian testified about Cross Technologies reforms, carefully positioning himself not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale about the costs of ignoring non-traditional expertise. But the star of the hearing was Maya. Her technical knowledge was undeniable. Her moral clarity was refreshing in a policy discussion usually dominated by corporate doublespeak. And her lived experience gave her an authority that no amount of academic credentials could provide. When the hearing ended, reporters swarmed. Maya fielded questions with the same calm competence she'd shown when Julian had laughed at her warning 9 months earlier. Julian waited until the crowd cleared before approaching. You were brilliant up there. I was accurate, Maya corrected. Brilliance is different. Fair point. He hesitated, then continued. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said months ago. Maya waited, her expression neutral. I'm sorry for laughing when you tried to warn me. for allowing Brandon to destroy your laptop, for every decision I made that day that valued my ego over your expertise. I'm sorry for representing every barrier you faced in trying to contribute your skills to this industry." It was the first time Julian had directly apologized, not through press statements or PR-crafted responses, but face-to-face, acknowledging the specific harm he'd caused. Maya studied him for a long moment. "You know what's strange? If you hadn't done all that, none of this would have happened. Codebridge wouldn't exist. These congressional hearings wouldn't be happening. The industry wouldn't be examining its credential bias." "That doesn't excuse it," Julian said quietly. "No, it doesn't. But it does mean your cruelty, accidentally, led to something meaningful." She shouldered her backpack, a new one, sturdy and expensive, but worn in the same casual way as her old taped-together one. "Apology accepted. But I'm accepting it for every person you've learned to see differently, not just for me." 1 year after the coffee incident, Julian stood in the lobby of the Austin Convention Center, watching the crowd gather for the inaugural National Technical Talent Summit. The event, sponsored by a coalition of tech companies, community organizations, and academic institutions, represented a sea change in how the industry thought about expertise and credentials. Codebridge had grown to serve 200 participants across 3 cities. Other companies had launched similar programs. Some universities had begun offering competency-based admissions. The credential industrial complex was beginning to crack, slowly but visibly. "Decent turnout," Maya said, materializing at his elbow. She'd gotten better at navigating crowds, though she still moved with the economical grace of someone trained by survival to take up minimal space. 3,000 registered attendees, Julian reported, representing 500 companies and organizations. "Your keynote sold out in 4 minutes." "My keynote is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable," Maya warned. "Good. Discomfort drives change." They walked together into the main hall, where vendors displayed innovative training programs, assessment tools, and hiring platforms designed to identify talent without traditional proxies. The hall showcased everything they'd been working toward: companies presenting credential-blind hiring processes, organizations supporting non-traditional technical education, platforms connecting overlooked talent with opportunities. But the centerpiece was a restored laptop in a glass case, Maya's original coffee-damaged machine, recovered and preserved as a symbol of how close the industry had come to missing voices it desperately needed. Beside the laptop was a placard with the simple message: they thought they could silence expertise with coffee and laughter. Instead, they ignited a movement. This destroyed laptop changed an industry. Imagine what we could achieve if we stopped destroying and started listening. Julian stood before the case, confronting his own failure preserved for posterity. Attendees stopped to take photos, to read the story, to reflect on their own assumptions about who deserves to be heard. "Still stings, doesn't it?" Maya asked, joining him. "Every time I see it," Julian admitted, "which is why it needs to be preserved, so others can learn from our mistakes without making them." Maya nodded approvingly. "That's growth." The summit buzzed with energy: workshops on competency-based assessment, panels on removing barriers to technical careers, networking sessions connecting non-traditional talent with forward-thinking employers. The change wasn't complete, wasn't universal, but it was undeniable. When Maya took the stage for her keynote, the crowd fell silent. She stood before 3,000 people, wearing her standard jeans and hoodie, refusing to perform the polished professionalism the industry typically demanded. 1 year ago, she began, I walked into a tech company's press event and tried to warn them about critical security vulnerabilities. My reward was having coffee poured on my laptop while executives laughed. That moment was captured on video and went viral, but not for the reasons you might think. She clicked to the now famous image, the destroyed laptop, the laughing executives, her own calm expression as she held up the USB drive. That moment went viral because it crystallized something millions of people already knew. Our industry doesn't actually care about expertise. It cares about credentials. It cares about pedigree. It cares about who you know, where you went to school, and whether your background matches an imaginary ideal. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Good, Maya thought. Discomfort means they're listening. But something unexpected happened after that moment. The company whose CEO laughed at me, they changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. They built programs that identified talent based on demonstrated skill rather than resume lines. They lobbied other companies to eliminate barriers that had nothing to do with job performance. They proved that change was possible. She gestured to Julian in the front row. Mr. Cross's company went through hell. Stock crashes, lawsuits, federal investigations. But on the other side of that hell, they became actually good at what they do. Because they started hiring people who had to be good at technology to survive, rather than people who had the privilege to study it casually. Maya clicked to data slides showing CodeBridge outcomes. Our participants, on average, identify security vulnerabilities 40% faster than traditionally credentialed analysts. Not because they're smarter, but because their life experiences taught them to scrutinize systems that claim to work, but actually don't. The room absorbed this. She saw heads nodding, people taking notes, the beginning of genuine reflection. But here's what I really want you to understand, Maya continued, her voice gaining intensity. I am not exceptional. I'm not a once-in-a-generation genius who miraculously overcame impossible odds. I'm an angry teenager who had to teach herself technology because adults kept failing her, and I got lucky enough to be humiliated on camera at a moment when people were paying attention. She paused, letting that sink in. There are thousands of people exactly like me. In shelters, in foster care, in precarious housing, in communities you don't visit, and situations you don't consider. They're teaching themselves skills because formal education failed them. They're solving problems because problems are in their way. They're brilliant because they had to be to survive. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is whether you're willing to see them. The applause started slowly, then built into something thunderous. People stood. Some were crying. Others looked shaken, confronting their own complicity in systems that had excluded talent they desperately needed. As Maya left the stage, a young woman approached her, maybe 19, wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days, holding a laptop held together with, yes, duct tape. I taught myself penetration testing living in my car, the woman said, her voice shaking. I've found vulnerabilities in major systems, but nobody will hire me because I don't have a degree, and my GitHub account has gaps because I couldn't always afford internet. After hearing you speak, I thought, maybe someone here would actually listen. Maya looked at the duct-taped laptop, seeing herself reflected in it. What's your name? Jasmine. Come with me, Jasmine. Let me introduce you to some people who are finally learning to listen. As they walked through the crowd together, Julian watched from the sidelines. The cycle was continuing, repeating, spreading. Every person like Maya who got recognized would create space for the next one. Every Jasmine who got heard would validate 100 others still waiting. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. The industry hadn't suddenly become a meritocracy where everyone with skills found opportunities regardless of background. But it was different than it had been a year ago. And that difference had started with one homeless teenager, one destroyed laptop, and one USB drive containing truths that powerful people hadn't wanted to hear. Julian's phone buzzed, another interview request about the transformation of Cross Technologies. He ignored it, continuing to watch Maya introduce Jasmine to potential employers, watching her systematically dismantle barriers that had seemed immutable just a year ago. The coffee stains never came out of that laptop. The damage was permanent, preserved in glass as a reminder. But permanent damage could become permanent change. And sometimes the best thing you could do with a broken system was refuse to let anyone forget how and why it broke. The summit continued around them, workshops, connections, slow grinding progress toward a future where expertise mattered more than credentials. It wasn't justice, but it was a start. And in the end, that destroyed laptop in its glass case became the most valuable artifact Julian Cross had ever owned, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The moment his empire of assumptions shattered against the reality of talent that refused to be ignored. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. On the screen, I've picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.